We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 207 for January 27th, 2021. I'm not your host, Chris Webster. However, Doug's your host, and on today's show, he leads a discussion about the pros and cons of virtual conferences. So throw away that lanyard collection you've been hanging on to because you're not going to need it, and because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CRM podcast. This is Doug. I am standing in from Chris, who can't be with us today. Today on the podcast, we have Heather.
Hi, everyone.
And we have Bill.
Hello. Looks like California represented.
Yeah, you guys are both California. It's
UK and California unite.
Oh, man. We're not quite halfway around the world, but we're pretty close.
Yeah, pretty close.
All right, but this is like completely aside from what we're actually talking about in today's podcast, which is online digital conferences. So with COVID, lots of conferences were obviously canceled in the spring of last year. Not a lot of conferences happened in the summer, but they definitely didn't happen this last summer. And now conferences are starting to move online. So the EAA, European Archaeology Association, had their completely 100% digital conference in September. And Bill has just gotten back from the SHA, Society of Historical Archaeology, who did a completely online digital conference as well that just ended yesterday or the day before. I think it was at the end of this week.
No, it was last Sunday. What's today, Sunday?
Okay, so it was a week ago, yeah. And I believe SAA and AIA are all going to be online and digital. And basically, for most of this spring, as we go into conference season, as it were, and it's pretty much going to be digital. And there might be some digital aspects going forward once COVID is vanquished and we can somewhat get back to normal. But yeah, Bill, you want to tell us about your thoughts on how SHA went and what you liked and disliked about doing a digital conference?
Yeah, sure. So basically, it's a lot. If you've ever gone to a conference before, I think my first Society for Historical Archaeology conference I went to in like 2002 or something like that. So I've gone every single year except for when my children were being born, or there was a year also where my father was sick too. So I've been to like 15 or so of the SHAs. They're always in January, which is a beast in its own self. And, you know, a lot of the complications of getting to the SHA, right? So all the travel, always trying to go through these winter vortices that seem to periodically pop up all over Canada and the United States right in the middle of a SHA. You know, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. So, you know, after having gone to a virtual conference, and I was just an attendee, so I didn't have to prepare a presentation. I was on a forum, but I didn't have to have anything prepared in advance. But like now that it's over, now that I went the entire time, I didn't take any of the workshops, but I started on, you know, Wednesday night, the 6th, and went all the way through till Saturday. I was involved in a lot of different things. And, you know, I saw that there's a lot of promise in having a virtual conference. I mean, the one thing that, you know, I mentioned before, the travel, like you don't have to worry about it anymore. You can just stay at your house. I mean, you can still attend the conference. You can still access all of the talks. And what was great about the structure of the SHA, all the people who signed up to give a paper, they had to record theirs as a digital file. I think in December, you know, early December was the due date. And, you know, it was really, if you've been in Zoom universe where most of us have been, it's not really that difficult for you to figure out how to click record on your Zoom thing. And the platform that they used made it really easy. It was just like YouTube to play their video, their recording. So, you know, some of the benefits are you've got your paper done a long time before you actually are supposed to give it. If you're one of the organizers, a lot of times, if you've ever organized one of these sessions before, you know that people wait until the very last minute, and then you don't actually, in fact, know what they're going to talk about as a discussant or to introduce them or anything until, some people do their paper the morning 3 a.m. before they're supposed to give the talk at 7 a.m. They're still working on their PowerPoint and stuff. All of that stress, all that stuff is gone because you have to have uploaded it by early December, and, it's all off your plate. So, travel is non-existent. The stress involved of getting your presentation together, that's definitely all gone too by having a virtual conference. And then, one of the major problems with going to a conference is there will be a lot of different discussions that happen at the same time. So it's hard to be in one room to hear this person talk. And then sometimes if you're like me and you monologue and go way over on every single question, sometimes the entire session is off. So when you show up at the time this person's supposed to talk, they're not there because it's off or it's late or someone didn't show up. So they decided to do 15 minutes early. And sometimes you just miss talks. The other thing about talks, live presentations, if you miss it, it's gone, because most of the time we don't turn these all into journal articles and stuff. So, if you miss that talk, that might actually be the only time that archaeologist talks about that thing, and there may be no more written, discussion of that research project. Well, with it being recorded, you can put all of your references and all those things in, and people can go back and stop the video, and they can write down the things that you said, and they can go look up those articles, and they can read those things. You can go back and review what you've missed in the discussion. So it's great that you can kind of slow things down and take notes on your own. And then another thing about those sessions, sometimes there may be 2 people that you really wanted to hear give a talk, but there's 12 people in that entire thing. And, the alternative is sit there and grind it through someone else's talk that you didn't necessarily want to see. Well, it's beautiful. You don't have to watch the ones that start off boring or a topic that you didn't want to learn about. I urge people to expand their horizons and listen to stuff they didn't know about. But seriously, you don't have to grind through these. That's not something that you have to suffer through. And then finally, because they're all video, I was going on walks, I was hanging out with my kids trying to get their online schooling to go through. I can have these talks running in the background, or I can have it kind of muted and looking at the screen of their slideshow while I'm helping do something else, washing the dishes. You can watch these talks and just listen to people talk about archaeology. And it's much more accessible. You can watch it on your phone, tablet, any which way, right? So, folks recorded their talks, and then the time period that they would have given all those presentations was open up to discussion. So it was a really great way to go into rooms and sit in there with people who were talking about things on a certain theme. And then you're just asking them questions and listening to, issues and things that are going on. It was a lively discussion rather than each one of us listening to a 15-minute, monologue of someone reading off their archaeology presentation. So I think that the accessibility, the portability and flexibility of the online conference, like all of those things, also its price. That's the critical thing. Folks who live in other parts of the world that can't afford to go to the UK or Canada or the United States, they can actually attend the SHA conference because they don't have to fly around the world. So there's a lot of benefits that I saw.
So you're saying all this wonderful stuff, Phil. Was there anything negative?
Yep. There's a lot.
Okay. Because I have a couple of questions, but it's more from the business side of things.
Yeah.
And a few others. So I think maybe I'll wait to see what the cons were.
Yeah, let's shift to the cons, right? Okay, the cons are, it's an archaeology conference. So all of the conferencing thing that you get, having dinner, talking to people, having drinks with folks, connecting, that's gone.
Yep.
So that's so important to someone's career. I've gotten a couple jobs going to conferences. If you were looking to get a job in archaeology and you were thinking that this conference was the way you're going to find employers, not happening. Not happening. Yep. So there's no sociability. There's no real interaction besides the forums. There was no place for you to interact and hang out with people like at the dinners and the receptions and stuff. So that's kind of the main thing of the conference, the informal interaction. It's just all of that's gone. So that's bad.
So can I jump in real quick with a slightly different way of doing that? At EAA, they actually had a social aspect, so like a social room. So one of the drawbacks to that is like, part of what happens in a conference setting is like people walk up or you're talking to someone and then they wave over their friend and they're like, hey, do you know so-and-so? And like, no, you don't and stuff. And like, sorry, this is a complete aside, but two of my friends and colleagues, I actually did that to at a conference. They were dating at the time. I was like, hey, do you guys know each other? And they burst out laughing because yes, they knew each other quite well at that point.
Better than you knew either one of them, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not just connecting with your old network. It's how your network actually expands. You get brought into other networks of your friends and your colleagues, or even just random people who happen to be like in that circle at that time because they were talking to someone else. You get like that third or fourth or 10th level connection. And suddenly you meet people, and that's quite nice. They kind of tried to do that at the EAA, where you could basically get randomly assigned to different people to talk to in this sort of social room, which was nice, but it still wasn't, it was no way to sort of replicate that introduction where you bring people over and say, hey, have you guys met? Oh, I think you guys would, really hit it off. You're both into X or Y or Z archaeology or something like that. So there's always that part, but I think probably a bit better of an attempt at EA at that, but it fell short of that aspect of the conference. Sorry, Bill, I somewhat interrupted you. I was just going to say that was the only other example I could think of where they tried something. It did a little better, but still couldn't replicate the social aspect.
Mm-hmm.
I would say definitely that was, obviously one of the first things that I thought of is the networking. Just like you said, you can't replicate that organic conversation that you have or the mingling. And my aspect, I'm always looking at it from the business perspective. So, not only is this, if conferences, because we're hearing this where people are like, you know what? Maybe we should just do conferences online now. Maybe more of them should be virtual. And so there's a lot of pros to that, Bill just mentioned. But then, a lot of the funding comes from marketing. A lot of the funding comes from companies coming in, having a booth, sponsoring events, paying for fundraising events, paying for the beer, the wine, the food, and then all the money that comes in from the fundraising event goes to the association. All that it's all generated by businesses, the ones that have the money. And it also, keeps the conference costs down. So, our company's still going to be willing to pay that money and to sponsor. There's just some things that are not going to happen at all. And then, so now you have, boards that are volunteer that are now really going to have to figure out another way of branding these kinds of conferences where they can actually still be bringing in that money, where it is, you can have the lanyards, right? Lanyards are a big deal. I mean, for somebody to get the lanyard for conferences, right, that you see that company's name everywhere. Everybody has it around their neck. So these are things that you can't have in a virtual conference. People just ignore. You might have like little bands that come at the bottom. So as far as marketing, I think marketing is going to affect the funding. And then I'll tell you, if a conference, let's say you have a conference, it's a hybrid. It's both. You can do it in person or you can do it virtually. They're likely, I say my company, if they can keep me working at my desk and I'm only selecting a certain amount of, actual subjects that are relevant to my area, my expertise, and then they don't have to pay for my, hotel or travel or any kind of thing, they're not going to be sponsoring me. And the same thing for students. If students can do it virtually, the scholarships, people would rather, associations and departments of schools would rather put their money towards other things rather than sending students to conferences. So now, there poof goes your attendance, right? So Yeah, it's a lot more complex, I think, than just how best to present, whether it be virtual or in person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, 2 points I'd like to raise. One is I think all virtual events, I think we're just on the cusp, like it's just beginning and people are sort of replicating what was before. But I do think we could get really smart and figure out ways of how to do virtual conferences that maybe not replicate, but could
Mm-hmm.
bring about those different aspects we were talking about, the social aspects. I mean, have you guys ever seen the Twitter conferences that Lorna has done? Those are pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a bunch of different ways.
Yeah.
You have people that do that for a living. So Twitter, I mean, those kind of conferences are run by people that are paid to be the best thinkers in that area, to create conferences that work. And I mean, I think it's a really good point. I actually, because of that, I could see companies like if I had all this time in the world and the tech savviness and all the branding and everything ability, I think a really good company to start right now would be virtual conferences.
Oh, yeah.
That associations pay that virtual conference. Virtual
Mm-hmm.
conference gets a percentage of all attendance, and they're the ones that make it happen. Because I can tell you, people that are on the board, and just talking about from an archaeological perspective, archaeologists really aren't tech savvy. Ask Chris. If Chris was here, he'd be all over this. They're just, as a group, are not tech savvy. They should be. They're not. And so on top of that, you have volunteers who are already busy in other parts of their life. They're not going to be able to put together something that's really engaging and on the, right on the cusp of the best conference option. They're just not going to put it together. They're too far behind. There's just not enough time, and they don't have the skill set.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree. So, I'm a new board of directors member of the Society for Historical Archaeology. And so, I got to go to some of the meetings, but I'm not one of the ones who's seen the budget for years. And I don't know, how everything totally works at the organization. But I know that conferences are a huge, huge thing for these nonprofit volunteer organizations like SHA, SAA, then your state and local one. And Heather, you hit it right on the head. If folks don't go to these conferences and they don't register to go to it, then the organization loses tons of money. And it gets to the point where the organization can't even actually exist. So SHA was lucky because their conference was before COVID, but the other organizations, the Society for American Archaeology, anyone else who came after that, April and on, where there was all these travel bans and stuff, it'll be interesting to see how they all, weathered the storm. And I don't, like I said, I'm not the one who sees the budget for the SHA. So I don't actually, in fact, know what the situation was for this recent conference. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see if membership is down, if advertising is down, and if people donated less to this one. I don't know. We'll have to see.
The other part I was going to bring up is like everyone's talking about like doing hybrid conferences coming up. I think that's going to be a huge problem because like there are quite a few companies that have now jumped into this digital conference aspect and, different providers, and it's just going to get busier, but it's not free. Like doing digital is going to be an expense. And if you still have the physical part is a huge expense. Like, because I've organized conferences, and like if you're at your small regional level or your state one, if you have 100, maybe you can get up to 200 people, maybe a bit more. It depends. You're okay. You're in a different league where basically you could go to, say, a church or a community hall or something like that, and they're going to charge you peanuts because they don't really do conferences and stuff. And you can get away with like having a nice projector screen and just a pretty low key 1 or 2 stream small conference, and your main cost is going to be probably food. If you even provide food. I mean, not every conference does. So you could do that cheap. You could charge 10, 15, 20, $30, whatever, and that will cover all your costs. But when you get to a conference the size of, say, SHA, SAA, EAA, you're in a completely different ballgame where you have to basically, as soon as you get over a couple hundred people, there's only a couple of venues in any city that'll take that on. universities or convention centers / hotels.
Mm-hmm.
And the price for those is astronomical. But I realize we're getting towards the time limit on the segment. So how about we pick this up on the other side, and we'll see you guys after the break.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
So we stopped last segment talking about conferences and hybrid. And the point I was going to come to is basically, if you're still having a very large conference and trying to do hybrid, it's going to be super expensive. You will have all the costs that are going to come with doing an in-person one. And if it's a couple hundred people, you're down to 2 or 3 venues in any city, and those venues are going to charge you a lot of money, and you can't get around that for the physical. And then if you try to do hybrid, like I do the Recording Archaeology YouTube channel, we record conferences, I've done EAA, and we do that as a volunteer. But like in terms of costs, if you had people there filming, not even live, just filming, you're talking in the tens of thousands as an additional cost. And then going live, not live, like I get this all the time from like conferences, be like, oh, can we live stream and stuff? I'll be like, guys, live stream basically comes down to your internet connection.
Yeah.
And I need a hardline internet connection at the venue. Small places don't have that. Big places do. And then they'll charge you like $1,500 for one line for a hard internet to be able to do that. Because if not, you can't rely on Wi-Fi or your phone or anything. Because one, depends on the room in the building. Your connection may not be strong enough to be able to do live streaming that doesn't like cut out every like 5 minutes and can actually handle it. Or if you're using the same internet that everyone else is, what do you know? 20 or 30 people suddenly jump on, and it's good enough for surfing, but it's not good enough for streaming. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to try to do a hybrid, like I don't know how people are going to do it, because what's going to happen is some venues will suddenly start providing that. They'll have all the equipment, but that equipment, like I've looked at it, like you're dropping $10,000 for a sound system and video to do a nice one per room, because you have to basically set up on a room setup and have it permanently in there, easily $10,000. They need to make that money back. So at the beginning, maybe the prices will drop, but the thing is when we're competing, we're not just competing against other archaeology conferences. Yeah. You're competing against tech. Yep. You're competing against pharmaceutical conferences where we complain about, spending $100, $200 or pounds or euros on a conference. That is deadly cheap. I've been to like computer conferences where like they don't bat an eye at dropping $1,000 for just the conference.
Yep.
And so going forward, I see like hybrid going to be really, really hard. Like lots of people are suddenly saying, oh, we should keep the digital aspect and try to merge the two, keep the pros of the digital and try to keep the pros of the in-person and somehow merge those two. I think like the hard reality of the dollar is going to come up against that. But what are your guys' thoughts on these sort of things?
Well, I would say, first of all, my experience is, you have people that are willing to pay the money, or they have somebody who's funding them, sponsoring them. People they go to every conference, at least for one association that's important to them. And they do that every year. It's just, you had those people. But who are the majority of your audience at every conference? It's the local, right? It's the local groups. So why are the local professionals, students, whatever, attending that conference that happens in Austin, Texas, let's say? They're attending because they were waiting for it to come to that area, and then they're going to go to the conference because it's a lot cheaper. They can travel. They may not have to use a hotel. All those things that we are saying are the pros behind, having a virtual conference. But now, that's all going to be taken away. If we do a virtual conference, the cost is still going to be there, just like, Doug was saying. And that's going to, the meat and potatoes of what these associations make on the locals, that's where they make the majority of their money. That and the businesses, which again, are going to be lost. So I think the virtual is really, especially because the price is going to go up. It is going to go up. Or even if it stays the same, it's still not, people are going to say, oh, well, we can afford to pay vendors to run all, that have that $10,000 system. We'll pay a vendor to do that. We'll pay a vendor to do this, pay a vendor to organize. And then next thing you know, it's the same cost as the regular conference. Then people start rationalizing and say, you know what, though? People don't have to pay for a hotel now. They don't have to pay for a hotel. They don't have to pay for airfare. So you know what? We can increase the amount a little bit more. Well, the majority of people that go to these conferences are not traveling all that far. They're local people. And so that's going to nix them out of, attending these conferences. People are not going to pay $1,000 and the only reason people pay $1,000 for computer science or in these other kind of conferences is because their company's paying for it. They're not paying for it personally. That's my 2 cents on that.
So true on like the funding. Yeah.
Yeah. My question though about this whole thing is because I just went through it and there are some benefits, right? So I know right now we live in Zoom universe where every single thing is on Zoom and it's just so easy to get burned out on Zoom, staring at the screen all day long. And I know that, right now with everybody totally overwhelmed, there's probably few people who want to sit there and watch, 10 hours of archaeology videos all day long to be saying that they're in a conference, right? Whereas we will do that if we're a captive audience at the actual conference. We will sit there and watch hour after hour of archaeology talks. So I think that maybe this year is not the best comparison. But as I mentioned, there are so many benefits. It's going to be difficult to put the genie back in the bottle because there are a lot of people. One huge thing that I saw that would never have happened is the Society of Black Archaeologists had a sponsored panel or had a sponsored thing where they had, probably 10 individuals who recorded presentations. So there were a couple folks who are Portuguese speaking folks. And, SHA has been trying to have folks write and record in their own native language and then just translate it or just let it be there and we can learn how to speak Portuguese. I mean, if we want to read their thing, right? So that whole aspect of people speaking in their native language is possibly something that could happen in the near future. I mean, the problem with that publishing in that is that you need to have folks who can edit that work in that language and folks who can, publish that work in that language. So I'm not going to say the journal's going to go fully, multilingual, but you can have sessions like they did where there's Portuguese speaking folks who will translate comments and questions from English to the other Portuguese speaking folks in the room. And then the Portuguese speaking folks can make comments and then translate it back and forth. Like that's, linguistically much more functional. And they actually did that. And I'd never seen anyone do that before at a SHA conference. And so, one of the things that this opens up is folks who live in countries where they can't even afford, folks who have never been to an SHA before ever, because even if they've been members, because they can't afford to come here, folks who can't afford to get access to these scholars because they don't have access to a library or it's too expensive for their book. We all know about academic press, jacking up the price on these books. Folks who have never actually gotten to see this person's research or thought, they can log in and see it. The economic factor, though, is what's critical because we don't know if the conference, made money, lost money, broke even. Like, we don't really know. I don't know how many people attended the conference because, once again, you don't see anyone, you don't see whether the conference hall is totally full. So you don't know how many people actually, in fact, signed up. But I think that there is a chance for some of these things to expand into parts of the world where folks have not really been able to participate. And then this goes back to the whole community thing, and definitely with CRM too. Maybe your company's not going to give you $1,500 to fly from here to Miami to watch a conference, but they'll probably drop $90 on you having access to the conference. And they might even actually, in fact, let you have 1 day of vacation time or personal development time to sit there and be part of a session to listen to it. So there is possibly the chance that we could get more membership for some of these archaeology organizations if they know that they can, have access to all these talks, if they can see all these things on their own time. So the companies, that's where we're in a dangerous area, an unknown zone where we don't really know what's going to happen, because the company might be reluctant to ever send its CRM folks to the conference if they can do their symposium online. Well, there goes a bunch of folks who were going to travel on the company dime to the conference. Now they're not going to do that. But on the other hand, we could have hundreds of more individuals show up for just this one, regional archaeological conference because there's a couple of interesting things and it's only $90. So the company's like, okay, sweet. Here's, 5 or 6 different memberships. Go ahead, go to the conference. You can watch all these things on TV. We don't really know what's going to happen.
Yeah. I could also see them possibly splitting these up where, you're only paying for a suite or this speaker or that speaker. But then, it'll be interesting because I think it'll definitely encourage. I mean, how many of these conferences do we go to where somebody gets up in front of the room and they literally read their paper?
My wife had to break me of that. I did that for years.
Oh, sorry. No offense, but it's like a real, I'd rather somebody wing it than read from their paper, because I can read your paper.
Yeah. Well, that's what the recorded ones were. There were people reading them into Zoom. So it better be really good because, you're listening to someone read an essay.
Good for your wife. See, that's a good partner that is honest with you and says, listen, honey.
But any partner that can see a shortfall in their spouse, that's either a strengthening thing for your relationship or a weakening thing.
Very true. Very true. So I think it will definitely encourage people to be more entertaining. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how people's presentations change and morph, because it really is. I mean, it's bad enough to sit in a room and watch somebody read from their paper. To me, I think it would be worse to have that. Although, some of the reason, or most of the reason why I think people read from their papers, because they're very nervous. I mean, you've got a lot of people in the room, maybe, and it's nerve-wracking. So maybe speaking and giving a talk on Zoom might be easier. Who knows? But, I definitely think, just like you said, it is the unknown. And there's so many aspects that, we can look at this and say, okay, this is an opportunity for us to make conferences better. Because a lot of us, we go to these conferences. I go to conferences. And just like you said, you have to sit through all the, the boring to get one good speaker, right? Or something you're really interested in. And so maybe this will force the hand of conference creators to really come up with a better way to present information.
So, like, the cynic in me thinks that in a year or two's time, we're basically either going to go back to normal, and everyone will be like, never again for Zoom for conferences. At which point, there might be a few digital things, but not much. I think a worst case scenario, though, would be like a mixture where we end up with essentially two-tier system, whereas you have digital conferences that are open and accessible and lots of people participate in. And then you have the in-person conferences. And basically it's going to be for the elite, people who have, grant funding, who can who's the owner of a business or, high enough up there that they can swing it to go to a conference. Because, some conferences are definitely in locations because they're a great place to visit. And people go to conferences that, like, I went to SAA in Albuquerque because I get my work to pay for it, and my family's there.
Mm-hmm.
So like there's those connections, but I do hope we don't end in like a 2-tier system where basically going in person to conferences becomes like, I'll use some archaeology lingo, elite status and elite items. And I think that could be the worst, but I would hope actually if we do start doing more digital, it actually gets really creative. Like I think we're just starting on the cusp of that. One thing I'm working on right now for one of my works is actually Society of Antiquaries of Scotland has this thing called the Rhine Lectures. Been going on for forever, 100-some years. Guy endowed it, Rhind. And it's people prepare for years to deliver these lectures. It's one person, they give 6 one-hour lectures over several days on like a topic, and they're intense. And this time it usually happens at the end of May. It was obviously canceled in person and then it was recorded. But what we've done is we've taken the recording and we're working with Wikiversity. So everyone knows Wikipedia, but there's actually a lot of other projects tied up with Wikipedia. So there's Wikiversity, which is open learning resources. And so what we've done is the speaker has given us all their references. So like the first talk, we have a lecture. It's going to be up there. It'll be an hour long. And then slide by slide, I think ended up being like on just the first talk, 85 references, but we've connected them. So we've put in the references. They're connected to like WorldCat. So if it's a book, you can go and find like your nearest library or publisher. If it's an article, we found, if it's open access, we link to that. If it's on like someone's put on like their personal website or university repository, or, if it's on ResearchGate or academia.edu, whatever. And so like you could basically watch the entire presentation and then click and go to all the resources without having to hunt down yourself. I think that would be actually kind of cool.
Very cool.
Going forward, if people did that, and then people will still do their, reading off presentations. But if you have some video editing skills and stuff like that, you could make actually really interesting presentation. You can make actually essentially a documentary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we're talking like talks are 50, okay. Obviously it depends on the conference and whatever, but 15, 20 minutes, 25, that is actually basically the length of a half-hour show. 22 minutes is roughly, give or take, depends on the country, but with commercial breaks and stuff like that. But like, it would be really interesting if instead of treating, I say this personally because I'm that person that Bill was like on about, who does their presentation at 3 a.m. when they're presenting at 8 o'clock or something like that. I'm trying to get better. Like the last time I presented, I actually like prepared like well in advance and stuff like that. And so I'm trying to actually improve instead of being that person who's just like, usually if I know the stuff, I can do an interesting enough presentation for 15 minutes where I don't make a complete ass of myself. And that's where I've set the bar, is just like not making a complete ass of myself, which is what I shouldn't be doing for the bar. And I would hope like, if you got this, like if it's digital, maybe I do like a whole production where I spend like, hours and hours putting together like the best presentation that I've ever done. And I've even thought about it. I've done like, we ended up doing some online stuff as well for teaching where you can use like Amazon, IBM, Google all have voice things. So you can actually write out your paper and then use semi decent sounding voices. There's, well, they're using neural networks now. So there's like 2 or 3 voices that don't sound like a robot's reading it off. The robots are super annoying. But, like if you're not into that and you want like a nice voiceover and stuff like that, or you even get a friend to do like a voiceover. And like, I think we could just get really creative with what we're doing with our presentations, or
for sure.
Even just like have a presentation actually be, say like a website or something like that, where you like, I don't know, choose your own adventure presentation. Like imagine if someone just like went up on like a digital presentation, gave you a link to a page, and then you went there and it's like, are you going to explore the site aerial or on foot? And then like did virtual that way.
Yeah.
Yep.
And like,
yep.
and like, everyone had a different sort of experience going through. I mean, like, imagine doing that, like what we do with all our digital stuff, but doing it in a conference presentation.
Well, the beauty of it is that folks recorded their stuff, right? So that opens it totally up. Like, you have 15 minutes of capture. Okay, choose your own adventure where it only takes 10 or 15 minutes to navigate through the entire thing. And then there's a PDF thing at the end where you can, read the talk, or, several slides at the end that you can actually read the slides off, right? Someone could totally create that. Someone could make a documentary and everything, but you're freed up to just freely talk about your research in the session. So there is no like staring down at paper and droning on like I used to do. There is none of that stuff really, because you got all the panelists, they're all there on Zoom. People have already watched it. They already have questions. They just kind of introduce each other, where they're from. And then we spend an hour and a half going through, I saw a series of great ones about doing field work during COVID. I mean, CRM folks talking about how they handle themselves in COVID, how they're still actually doing archaeology out in the field. I mean, those were really interesting sessions to sit in. And, you got to watch their talk, which, talked about the case study that they were using, but really just bouncing questions back and forth. Did, Haswapper train you to be ready for this? No, it didn't necessarily. Did, trying to extract DNA from bodies prepare you? Yeah, because you have to have a clean area. People can't be breathing on this when you're trying to extract DNA from burials and stuff. So yeah, we already had a decontamination. And then it goes into a whole series of questions and conversations that are totally interesting that no one could have really fit into a 15-minute talk. So now you're freed to do whatever. And, I guess that's one of the benefits. The question is, how are we going to get people to pay? Like, how are we going to get people to pay to become members? How are we going to get, revenue to keep the entire organization going? Because it's not just the talks and everything. I mean, folks are handling collections and doing advocacy on Capitol Hill and doing all kinds of stuff through our organizations. And if they all die off because nobody wants to go to, I don't know, St. Charles, Missouri. I went there. I don't care. I was afraid. I went, but then again, I could afford it, right? So people don't want to go to the one that's too far away, right? Or go through a polar vortex just to get there. Like, I can totally understand that. But if everything's just opened up on the internet, what does that mean for our organizations?
I think we'll tackle that on the other side of the break.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
So we ended last segment talking about a bit of the financial and will this affect societies and whatnot. And I'll just share a little bit of my personal experience. I've been involved with a local conference, TAFAC, Tayside and Fife Archaeological Committee Conference. This year we went digital. In the past, I'd recorded other conferences. I went out and recorded people's presentations. When we're talking about how to do like interesting presentations, one of the talks is on a carved stone ball. For any of our listeners, we'll drop a link in it. It is like a very Scottish artifact. And it's just what it sounds like, a carved stone ball. But they're a big deal. And we actually went to the site where it was found, did a little recording there, and then we recorded in the museum where it's at now. So it was actually kind of a more interesting video and presentation than what we'd done. But I'm totally getting sidetracked. They basically asked for donations, and it was all online and free, but they said, hey, when you guys are signing up with Eventbrite to go to the conference, do you mind donating, a $5, $10, whatever. I don't remember the exact amount, and I probably shouldn't say it, the ballpark, because it's not my organization. But essentially, it covered all the costs of the virtual. Like, us driving out to film people, it didn't quite cover my time, but I've never charged for my time. Hosting, all that stuff, everything was basically covered and then some. So actually, the organization ended up in the black out of just asking for donations. So I think potentially, again, it'll be hard to see how it goes. EAA, I think, was all free and online. SHA, I think that was charged on, Bill, you don't know the exact, amounts and whatnot. But I mean, there is a cost for digital and there'll be a cost for services and stuff. But I mean, the cost of actually renting out a place and doing all that work, I would not be surprised if actually digital is somewhat viable in the future. I think the real problem will be like if it comes down to like, one organization does a in-person conference and one does a virtual conference, and then there's like that competition where I can only afford one conference. I could actually do both, but I'll go to the in-person one this year. Stuff like that where like budgets get a bit cut. I think I don't know. It'll be really hard to see, but I think there is the potential where digital could keep a lot of organizations going if it needed to.
I think, and I know I'm kind of, I sound like I'm going to both sides here, but I think it all depends on how the conferences react to this virtual medium and whether or not they're willing to get outside of the box. Because when you think about it, entertainment, right, has changed just in the last 10 years with the influx of YouTubers and different ways of people being able to provide entertainment that is very low or no overhead, and they're still making a ton of money, where you have people that, spend a lot of money to provide or to create content, and they have to get, so much more out of it in order to, make a profit. So I think that, like you said, I do think that there is a potential of certain conferences maybe making more money than they ever did before. Why? Because they have that exposure that the internet provides. If they're smart enough about, getting the word out about their conference, and you have all these social media that's free that you can be advertising, your content or your conference easily and cheaply, obviously.
Well, I totally agree on what you're saying. I mean, it's going to be more complicated, though, if you aim on using free advertisement and social media to get maximum effect, because as we know, you can't just make a thing and put it into the internet and anyone ever find it. I mean, you have to connect through social media. You got to promote it. You have to have several different things that are connected. Otherwise, you just created another digital thing and then stuffed it in the internet and like nobody knows it exists. So those organizations that are savvy, that, have a couple of folks, like we're talking about influencers, but when it comes to archaeology, people who have like 100 followers telling the world about your thing. I mean, that's critical for if you try to do what you're saying, if you're going to try to use the social media route, like you gotta have some stuff, and you gotta have a decent plan to game the internet to get what you want out of it.
Well, I do think that it is going to even things out a bit. So now we have the big conferences that everybody wants to go to. There's only a few of them. And now you're going to have all these other, universities are going to pop up with their own little conference. Universities usually do their own anyway, but now they can actually have more than just their graduates or undergraduate students coming to watch the graduate students give talks. You can have, you have to have good content or it's not going to go anywhere. But like you said, you do have, you have people, like you guys were saying, from all over the world that wouldn't normally be able to go to Berkeley and watch graduate students give their talks, So now you're going to have people that are starting from zero that can actually start making some money on conferences they never even thought they could. And then, as far as fundraising goes, and then but that's going to kind of take a bite out of the larger conferences. And then you have the idea now is that you have unique content. So you have somebody right now, I can go to 3 conferences in a year and present at each one of them. And I can present something that's interesting. And likely I'm not going to have the exact same people in the room every single time at all the different conferences.
Yeah.
Now you have a much higher likelihood of that happening. So our association is going to say, okay, you are going to present this content, and then you cannot go and present that content at another conference, because otherwise, what's the purpose? It's just going to be whoever has the first conference first, right? Or who has the first conference gets the best presentations, and then it's just going to be the same presentations. Now there's no, I can't go to Texas at this time. I can sign up for anything anytime I want.
Yeah.
I can see people saying there's going to be exclusivity of content, and then you can present it here, but you have to sign off that you're not going to put it on YouTube or anywhere else for another year. Yeah, I think it's going to, not good or bad, it's definitely going to change how people approach.
Well, yeah, but I mean, we do riffs on the same like if you think about your graduate research, you did 2 or 3 conferences and you just did different aspects because it's only 15 minutes. So I don't think that's going to stop people from talking about their work.
I don't either. But, if you're doing something really cool, like a really neat presentation that's going to be virtual and people can tune in, and then you're going to play it again. I mean, if you have a conference, is the conference going to be virtual? And then those recordings, like we were saying, are going to be able to be watched by people later on down the road? Then why would I even go to another conference if it's basically going to be the same top billing people? It doesn't make sense.
It would actually be, I think it would be helpful as well in the sense of also, well, I could see it going horribly wrong in that, like, you could then see a lot of gatekeeping where people kick out people. But also it would help with like, 'cause, God, the big conferences, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., wall-to-wall presentations, 15 minutes, because everyone who goes needs basically to get your work or your university or whoever to pay for it or to be worth the time. Usually you have to give a presentation. But like, this would actually probably help a lot of digital conferences as well, because we at the beginning of this I went through training with Wikimedia about like doing online trainings and stuff. And basically the biggest takeaway from online is like 2 hours. That's where people basically die. Online is a lot more draining than in person because essentially you have to focus only a couple of your senses, and it just eventually wears you out. And so like the one conference we did that was a local one, it's usually a day conference. We cut it into two. It was a Saturday and a Sunday so that it could just be a morning and like roughly 2.5 hours. There's questions and stuff like that. And when you do questions, it got more interaction stuff. But like people can only do a couple hours of digital. And so if you could find a way to like limit conferences to be like, yeah, that's it. You only get 2 hours per day of actual conferencing. It would both help people's like physical and mental health. But I think if you could limit people, I think if it was done well, you could both make conferences better by just limiting the content and saying,
how do you do that and be competitive, right? So now you're going to have association. I think it's a really good idea, and I think it's very valid. But now you're going to have you do that. You limit the content. Now you have conferences going to say, okay, well, I want really good speakers, right? So I'm not going to. So now the idea of having graduate students presenting their work is not going to be as viable.
I know. And the sad part is like a lot of graduate students are going to be way better than some people who've been doing it for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, actually, you're going to want the grad students because they're still humans and they haven't fully gone into a robot mode like me. They're not a cyborg. So yeah, you want some of those students.
But if you only have limited, how many graduate students, when you have that Saturday night dinner, right? And you have the guest speaker. How many times have we seen a graduate student be the guest speaker at the
Never.
Never. Right. Never. So that's what I'm afraid of, is if we're limiting it to 2 hours a day, which I think we should, they're really just going to have to, there's going to be a complete overhaul.
Well, that brings us back around to the whole hybrid concept, right? So there's like certain sponsored ones where, they look through what topics are folks, concerned about, like what made a huge breakthrough that year. Maybe we invite the people from that session or that organized symposium to record all their talks and then have an open forum, right? So then all the, key scholars are in there too. And like, you know what I'm saying? But then the rest of the folks have to actually just give an analog presentation unless they want to record it themselves and do something interesting on their own website. So, it's not like, I guess you could see that kind of nepotism seeping in again, where they just keep whoever the popular one is, they keep choosing them again and again to do the recorded session. But, I think that some recorded, some not recorded, but they're only available to conference goers. So either which way, you got to pay for membership. Like, I think that might be the future way.
I think also it'd be an opportunity to like evaluate how we do things and make it better. So I've always found that super annoying at conferences that like, so when I did CAA UK, we had 2 keynotes, and what we chose were early career people who just got their PhDs. They were out on the job market, and being a keynote speaker at a conference would look, I mean, obviously it's not going to get them a job without uber competitive the job market is for academia, but we chose people who do interesting stuff and who actually being a keynote would make a difference. Because man, I can tell you I've gone to so many conferences just with all the recording and stuff. And never once have I been like, the greatest talk I saw at that conference was the keynote.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, keynotes will usually be good because sometimes they pick people who have a lot of experience and they'll pick people who are good speakers. But usually it's like all the keynotes tend to be like stale, pale, and male is the term that they use in the UK.
Wow.
But it's all people who are senior towards the end of their career. And, when it's keynote, they like pay for like their travel and all that stuff. And they get into the conference for free. I mean, these people, are like professors Uber or professor emeritus. They've retired, while they still have good retirement and like good pension, whatever. They don't need the money. They don't need the prestige. And I would love to see a lot more conferences be like, let's pick some people who are interesting, young, and who like getting their work out there would make a difference to their career, as opposed to this is like the 40th keynote I've given at whatever conference it is, yada, yada. It means no difference to me.
I totally agree with you on that. Actually, one of the worst talks I ever heard was given by Ian Hodder. And I paid a lot of money because I thought that was going to be a really cool. I usually don't pay. I don't know. I was reading his stuff and I thought that'd be kind of a fun talk to hear. And you know what the best part of that talk was? Hopefully he doesn't listen to this podcast. I doubt he does, but
he might. I know I told him about it, so keep going.
Well, I will keep going then. Maybe I'll be his little, I don't know, reveal here.
It was 11:15 on the 17th of January, 2021, when I watched Heather self-humiliate burn her entire career to the ground.
No, not going to happen. The most entertaining part was my husband at the table making everyone laugh because actually he came across as being very, very arrogant. And, it was a very egocentric talk. And he talked a lot about himself and a lot of what he said didn't make sense. But anyway, so it was an enjoyable talk because my husband, who's got a funny sense of humor and as a straight shooter, kind of gave his non-archaeological perspective and had the whole table laughing. But sorry, Ian, but maybe it wasn't one of your better talks.
I met him a couple times and I like the guy, but I thought that, I guess I'm going to make a whole country mad. I thought that was just being British. I thought he was just normal and British. And I was like, oh, okay, that's just how you are.
Yeah. He missed the mark for me.
I think you might have missed him because I have seen some good talks he's given before. So actually, I've never seen one where it was like totally boring or whatever.
It wasn't boring.
Oh.
It was just not about archaeology. So anyway, it was about himself, which is kind of a thing I'm really not into. But the point I'm making is when Ian Hodder was on the billet for that dinner, it was packed. I mean, it was hard. It was sold out immediately. So, yes, I think, could you have had somebody give a talk? Maybe a graduate student would have even be better than Ian Hodder's talk. But you sell tickets to that dinner months in advance. And people are not going to be clamoring to buy those tickets for that dinner. And this is just an example for that dinner months in advance. If it's a graduate student they've never heard of. So, as much as I think it's a great idea, I think that it's certainly not, as far as a marketing ploy, it's not going to work. The idea of marketing is to present something that people want. Period. Not that people should do or what they're obliged to do. It's what people want. People are willing to spend their money because they look at it. I want it. I'm going to pay for it. I'll pay more for it because I want it even more. That's marketing. And so by putting out there that you're going to have graduate students, which I'm sure at the time I could sit back and say, holy cow, I had no idea this guy's going to be so good. But when I was paying the money and willing to pay the $100 to get into that dinner, I wasn't going to bank on the fact that the graduate student was going to be good. I paid $100 because I wanted to see Ian Hodder talk in a smallish type room. where I could have dinner and listen to them. So I just think, we have to get, for all these different reasons, the associations are really going to have to go to the drawing board and really figure out how are they going to market and brand these conferences. And the person who the association figures out first is going to benefit first, I guess.
Well, there's the potential. I mean, it's digital. Basically, with digital, there's one winner and everyone else loses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could kind of hope that this might open stuff up for smaller societies, where people are say the Society of Black Archaeologists. Correct me if I'm wrong. I might be wrong on this, Bill, but I don't think you guys have ever had a conference.
No.
But you then did the digital workshop. Was it summertime?
Yeah.
It had 2,000 people,
Yeah.
2,500, something crazy like that. I do wonder if we'll either end up with just one Uber conference. It will just be known as the Archaeology Conference. It takes over the entire world, and that's all. We don't do small ones anymore. It's just Uber. Or it goes completely the other way, and we just have 600 conferences. Well, there's probably already 600 conferences, but 6,000 conferences. Every unique niche topic has its own conference on the pottery of the Lower Gila Basin, has its own conference every year. Plus, then the Upper Gila Basin pottery ceramic people have their own conference. I don't know. I'm just making up stuff at this point, but it could go that way where we just end up with thousands upon thousands of archaeology digital conferences.
Zoom calls.
Yeah.
Just endless Zoom.
And then it just gets lost.
I believe that was a Black Mirror episode.
You mean Reality 2020?
Yeah. And with that, I think we're going to have to end the episode. We've already gone longer than our typical episode. Chris is probably as he's editing this, looking at his clock right now and thinking, oh, you guys, I will get you back.
Chris, I tried to stop them. I tried to stop them, Chris. They just wouldn't stop.
Oh, Chris, you can't see the comments down here, but Bill's like, hey guys, we've hit 20 minutes. Let's go for 25, maybe 30.
Oh, dear. Why don't we take a little time? Maybe we should take some time and I just do my public apology to Ian Hodder now. Should I do that now?
Yes.
I
think
no, not going to happen.
Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap this up here then with no public apology.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about.
All right,
here we go. All right.
Are you ready? You guys all ready?
Yep.
Goodbye.
Thanks to the people who joined us here. Thanks to our listeners, and I'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.